Elegy Underground by Fiona Mcfarlane. By the time the angels came, nobody had any idea what they were. It wasn't just that people didn't talk about God anymore, but that nobody officially died and the afterlife was no longer required. That's how the portable cemeteries started, all the old graveyards having been turned into long lawns with swimming pools at the end of them, and the market in clandestine obituaries that meant people would answer the telephone to have names and dates whispered down the line before anyone could trace the call. And of course the illegal elegy smuggling, in which we played a dangerous part. Part of the problem was that the angels arrived at the same time we did, and people got us confused. We were a circus and they were the messengers of the Almighty, but we dressed similarly. We all wore our hair long. For us, it was for the act. Philomena Tinkerbell could pull 11 of us along with one plait. Diamante Hollywood could walk up her own ponytail. Salmonella Jones could pull live fish, musical instruments and, on special occasions, a tree from her curls. And I, Lachrimae Bird, hid the day's takings in my braids. The angel's hair, as far as we could tell, had no purpose, although it moved as if it had leaves in it. The kids got interested in the way it clogged the gutters. Otherwise it was useless, except that it was gold. A lot of people travelled in that time, moving from place to place, and a lot of people stayed still and waited for things to come to them. The seasons came, and so did night and day, the moon by now looking more like a comet than ever. But other things came too. Men passed through towns setting up enormous screens onto which they shone movies that replicated in real time the static fuzz of sleep. In the inland places that had almost forgotten the sea, a troop of 30 fox-faced boys circulated an enormous ceramic trumpet that they unstopped at dusk. Scientists discovered that the resulting sound of the waves increased people's appetites. The plastic surgeons came and took photographs of everyone in town. 20 years later they came back with their grey gloves and steady banker's fingers and remade your face, if you wanted them to, according to your files. And because people struggled with memory, they looked forward most of all to the birthday visits of the biographers who offered to chronicle the past year and present it within a week, bound in blue leather. At that time, the people who stayed put could have almost anything they wanted if they waited long enough for the right person to arrive. Fingerprints bloomed from the briefcases of salesmen. Trucks shipped in comfortable temperatures. New words were delivered to the door every morning. The girls of one town wrote away for a merman, and he swam up the drainpipe and entertained all of them with his salty muscles from the bottom of a bathtub. The cemeteries came at night, moving slowly but always gone by morning. They were flat and wide and ungainly, and often had to skirt the towns that had narrow roadways, in which case you brought your dead out beyond the last low-roofed bungalow and waited by the highway. Some had real gravestones and ivy and their own dim moon. Others grew roses and little plaques and released doves for you at extra cost, and some were just box upon box or filing cabinets. The most expensive would let you revisit and leave flowers. The others you could just follow behind for a while, until you were more or less politely asked to move off. On the road, life meant never stopping, even if the whole place was filling up with angels. Our philosophy was that life was a journey, and it was only those of us who never stayed still who really understood it. Somehow we were all born to it, because we were all born nowhere. On aeroplanes, in the cabins of cruise liners, at train stations. With my mother, it was an ambulance that couldn't go fast enough. It was as if she'd given birth and then aimed me into the world with a kick, and I've kept moving ever since. Our act was all girls. There were companies similar to ours, but they performed naked and put their gymnastic abilities to other uses after the show. The difficulty was arriving at a new place and convincing people that we intended to keep our clothes on. On our first night, the audience was always entirely male. Salmonella Jones would stride out with her boots above her knees and her mass of hair. A low groan would come from the audience, a sound that grew legs and turned into a walking roar. But Salmonella's voice was larger than space, and as she spoke the girls began to tumble out of her hair, though I always felt it was her voice they were hiding in, slipping out through the O's and the P's. Soon the men forgot that our boots and coats could come off, because Sincerity Smith had wooden wings painted like a parrot that grew naturally from the base of her neck, and Penicillin Brown could swim on a tightrope, and China Foxtrot swallowed bubble after bubble until she floated above the audience, blowing bubble after bubble back out of a long blue pipe. And my job, in every town and on every night, was to collect money for tickets, which I did out of a fishbowl from which I splashed the patrons who fainted when Mimosa and Murder, the Siamese twins, began pulling each other out of a hat. It took some time for every angel to get here, and they'd obviously been instructed not to start proceedings until everyone had arrived. In the meantime, the first few of them relaxed a bit and took a look around. They had the uncanny habit of peering massively into people's windows at exactly the time you realised it had gone dark without your noticing it. They weren't entirely solid, so sometimes you passed through them and realised it from a kind of gauzy feeling, and then you said, "Excuse me." Frighteningly, they had perfect pitch. We know this because they practiced their singing in their sleep, otherwise they kept very quiet. When it became clear that they weren't going to provide any services, people began to assume they were some kind of law enforcement group here to crack down on death. The cemeteries, the obituaries, the immoderate display of emotion, and, perhaps most of all, the elegy smuggling. It was this in particular that concerned us at the circus. It's true that we carried elegies. We were known for it in certain circles, and the more sympathetic of the graveyard men would tell the more persistent of their mourners about us. We hid them in Salmonella's hair, China's pipe, between the wooden feathers of Sincerity's wings. But most of all we hid them in my memory, which somehow had the strength of a tree. Other people with memories like mine had gone into business on their own, as biographers or fortune-tellers. All these people made a very comfortable living, because everyone was nostalgic for both the past and the future, and it wasn't unheard of for a biographer to stop work and stop himself, settling in the one spot, waiting for his own biographers to arrive. My theory about my memory is linked to my name. My mother called me Lachrimae because, like most people, she had forgotten the meaning of many words. But she didn't know that in naming me after tears in a forgotten language, she had waterproofed me for an unusual and dangerous kind of life. Life from a fishbowl, with a mind designed for remembering the dead. There was a time when I imagined my memory as a graveyard so vast and orderly that it lost its wheels and took root. It began on one small patch of ground and grew slowly outwards, covering parking lots and football fields. The older graves, elegies for humble fathers, lines on a patient sister, crumbled a little under the weight of the newer ones. But the souls of these dead sat humbly and patiently waiting for me to find them again. In each new town we distributed remembrances for the local dead with the tickets. Not to everyone, but randomly, and it was up to me to decide. None on the first night, then I gauged people by their reaction to my fishbowl. Did they stroke it and make low noises as if it were a cat? Did they try to throw things into it, or did they notice me at all hovering in my glass lung? As time went on, I became bolder and counted people off by number, or gave elegies to everyone wearing red. The elegies became riskier too. Some of them weren't about specific people at all, but about the things that had been forgotten, the insomniac's algebraic concentration, the quiet certitude of the knitter of bones, the writer of letters whose fingers bred blisters. And because they somehow resembled the impossible, memorable things we could do with our bodies, These elegies took root. We became quietly famous, in a way that meant we always had to be moving, leaving a town almost as soon as we got there, 2 nights, maybe 3. In some places we left immediately after the first performance, speeding on the highways the way the cemeteries do. Because of the angels who stood quietly now in supermarket aisles and flocked on the slopes of golf courses, the decision was made to stop smuggling elegies altogether. It seemed too risky under all that surveillance. Salmonella, our ringmaster, made the final call. She hunted them out of wings and boots and hair and fish bowls. There was nothing she could do about my memory. I told her she could trust me. My mother missed the hospital and prepared me for a riskier kind of life, full of leaving. I hear that when she left, they buried her in a country churchyard, one of the quick, tricky ones that knows the back routes and spends long winters lumbering by the docks of coastal cities. What would an elegy for her sound like? The only angel I've ever seen close up was the one who came to see the show. He seemed made up entirely of colours, and his teeth were bright as dithyrambs. No one but me expected that he might be wearing wings, and I must admit to being disappointed when he wasn't. He was so sadly official that he appeared entirely stationary, even when moving. But then when he stopped, every part of him kept on shifting, so he was never still. He drew his legs up to his chest to fit into the front row seat, and didn't seem to notice that he'd blocked the view of all the people behind him. He arrived a little late, just as the girls were somersaulting out of Salmonella's hair. They fell at his feet, nonplussed. Penicillin even used him later in her act, springboarding off one mythic knee to reach her tightrope. He watched the act with interest, I thought, his head even tilting upwards slightly as Diamante climbed up her thick ponytail, her own fairy tale prince. One of China's bubbles popped against his left temple as she hovered around his ear, almost big enough for her to sit in. But the applause just before the interval seemed to surprise him. He swung his head back and forward slowly to see what was making all the noise. And I noticed for the first time how hands clapping together resembled the angel's wings I had imagined. Flesh feathers making the sound of 1,000 of them in flight. The angel stood up to leave. He was so tall he was almost invisible, but was diminished somehow, like a powerful man who has forgotten something. As he passed my fishbowl, I swam up to meet him, breaking into the air as I never did during performances. The other girls were all bowing, and between the thumb and forefinger of his mammoth right hand I tucked my best elegy, my last. I watched him as he walked down the street, moving as if he were wearing ice skates, as if he were here for the end of the world. He bent his head over my elegy to make out the words. Like us, he had the air of someone who is always going away.
Elegy Underground by Fiona Mcfarlane was read by Bethan Walker. The producer was Gemma Jenkins.